Hello and welcome everybody. I hope you can see me. I know that people are still joining us at the moment. Welcome to ICON Scotland's 23rd Annual Plenderleith Memorial Lecture. My name is Krista Gedbrugger, not ICON webinar, and I'm the outgoing chair of ICON Scotland and your host for tonight. We had hoped to bring you this event from Edinburgh's wonderful city art gallery, but like so many things this year, for the first time, it is coming to you from beautiful East Lothian or wherever you are at the medium of Zoom. Irrespective of way, ICON Scotland Committee extends a very warm Scottish welcome to you. We're particularly appreciative that you chose to be with us tonight, as we are aware of stiff competition from a number of compelling online events in Scotland's heritage sector tonight, which shall remain unnamed. I do wish them all success, as they are an indication of the active nature of our sector here in Scotland. And that gives me great hope for the future. As we say in my native Germany, alle Jahre wieder. At this time every year, we hold our prestigious lecture in memory of Dr. Harold Plenderleith. He was born in 1898 in Dundee and is widely regarded as the founder of the conservation profession, both in the UK and internationally. As an archaeologist, he worked on the most iconic excavation sites like the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt, Sir Leonard Woolley's excavation site at Ur, as well as Sutton Hoo ship burial. He went on to found the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research at the British Museum in 1924. And after his retirement in 1959, he became the first director of the International Centre for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property in Rome, or ICROM, where he served until 1971. He helped set up and then served on the Council of the International Institute for Conservation, the IIC, from its creation in 1950 until 1971, and was IIC's president from 1965 to 1968. Dr. Plenderleith was for many years the patron and honorary chair of the Scottish Society for Conservation and Restoration, the SSCR, which is a predecessor organisation of ICON Scotland. Dr. Plenderleith died in 1997, and the SSCR established a successful annual public lecture in his memory starting in 1998, the centenary of his birth. Since then, every year we invite leading figures from the conservation, heritage, archaeology, or museum and galleries world as speakers to share with us a special insight into their field of work. And this year, we are honoured and delighted to welcome Euan Leitch as speaker. Euan is the director of the Built Environment Forum Scotland, an umbrella organisation with policy interests across archaeology, buildings and landscapes. He has a background in architectural history and urban planning. Euan's worked for public bodies, local authorities and charities, and his work has moved from physical conservation to conservation policy. During 2020, the corona pandemic has resulted in a profound crisis for the heritage sector in Scotland, which is likely to impact us all for many years to come, in spite of the fabulous recent use of successful vaccines. The Built Environment Forum Scotland, or BEFS, has been instrumental in pulling the different strands of the built heritage sector together at this time to find strategies and policies that can help us find ways through the choppy waters ahead. Euan has a perhaps unique overview of development in the sector and also played an important advocacy role during these last 8 months in particular. Through BEFS, he engages with members of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government to try and influence policy and legislation that improves the condition of Scotland's historic environment for the benefit of people. In 2020, BEFS created the COVID Historic Environment and Resilience Forum, also known as CHERF, in an attempt to understand the short and long-term impact of this unfolding event. We look forward to hearing about its findings from Euan in his talk 2020, A Great Disruption, Plus ça change. Another first for us, and an attempt to instill an interactive live element, tonight's slightly shorter lecture will be followed by a discussion panel with leading figures from the Scottish heritage sector. We welcome Lucy Kassad, Chief Executive of Museum Gallery Scotland, William Napier from the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings Scotland, Mark Watson, convener of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation Scotland, and Ayrshire lass Sarah Crofts, who is Chief Executive of ICON. And our audience members do, of course, have the ability to ask questions. Please use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen for that. But first of all, welcome Euan and over to you.
Thank you very much, Krista. I'm presuming you can hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver the Plenderleith Lecture this year. I've always viewed the Plenderleith as illustrious, and I therefore feel intimidated slightly and overwhelmed, I suppose, to be invited to give this when Krista approached me. So I'm delighted to be able to talk to you all, and thank you very much for the introduction describing what BEFS actually does. Krista, I don't think I need to add anything more to that. I'm impressed that so many people have tuned in for an evening's discussion, which is with somebody who works in policy and trying to influence policy, which is a vague and broad area, and BEFS remit is also very vague and very broad in terms of its description of the built environment. And as a member of BEFS in the past, when I was working with other organisations, I always used to wonder what BEFS does. Now I've worked for BEFS for 7 years. I still wonder what BEFS does, but I know what we do in terms of our relationship with the Parliament and in trying to influence policy and legislation. And we're grateful for having a broad membership, which obviously has included ICON Scotland for a number of years. Just invited me tonight to talk about what has happened across the sector this year in light of what's happened with the COVID pandemic. And I suppose what I'm going to talk to you about is quite broad brushstrokes, starting with some of the events that we had in June and the beginning of July, which was obviously early on in the pandemic. And I will then move into what the findings were of that, some of the directions that were suggested in that, and then probably maybe more from a personal perspective, some of my other wider observations about how the heritage sector in its broadest sense has responded to some of the issues that have arisen because of the pandemic, and where that may take us in the future. Obviously, a lot has happened in the past few months, and I suppose it's been 2020 has been a year which, from my perspective, feels like lots and lots has happened, but also nothing has happened because we've been quite stationary in our daily lives, and we've all been working from home. BEFS is obviously working from home. We're working from home permanently from now on. We've given up our office for the foreseeable future. But going back to June, when we were a few months into the pandemic, and we created CHERF, as Krista described, and we created CHERF primarily to give people a voice, to bring people together from across different professions and interests, because we were aware that people were working within their own area of interest, but heritage spans so much, and the organisations intersect with each other, and their interests are different, but often complementary. But we thought bringing people together, there was clearly an appetite from our members at one of our quarterly meetings that there was a need for people to come together to discuss what the impact was. We were looking for it to be constructive, and we were looking for ways out of what seemed at that time maybe a short-term situation. I suppose back in June, we definitely didn't think that we would still be living in almost lockdown in the autumn. And now obviously things have quite changed. So when we set up the meeting, there were two questions that we agreed with Historic Environment Scotland that we were going to look at. And I should say that we work very closely with Historic Environment Scotland. They are our primary funder. BEFS is a very small organisation. There are only 4 employees, only 2 of us work full time. So we are light, but I think we managed to do a lot with the staff that we have. So we agreed that there were 2 questions that we were going to look at. One being, what is heritage's contribution to recovery? And 2, what are the threats that are arising out of this? And it was much easier to discuss the threats that were arising out of the pandemic, and clearly bringing people together for the first time. We met over 5 weeks. We had about 113 participants in the discussion, and each one we had people from various sectors, from local authorities, from conservation, from archaeology, and others, speaking about their experience, and from the Development Trust Association as well, speaking about their own experiences or their members' experiences within the pandemic. And I suppose the prime thing that came out as an impact of the pandemic was a complete loss of activity, and therefore a loss of income for everybody. And that is universal. It's not just the heritage. We were aware of it happening in the tourism sector. But obviously that loss of income very early on in the year, and at the point that we were meeting, people were discussing about opening for the summer, and we had one event just about reopening sites. But mainly it was people's fear of what that loss of income was going to be and how long people were going to have an absence of income. And it was around at that time that the job retention scheme was introduced, and some people were already on furlough, but obviously at that time the furlough was going to be ending in October. So there was a sort of end in sight to some degree, or so we thought. The other impact that people were discussing was the impact it was having on volunteers. And so within our sector, a lot of work happens with volunteers, and the demographic of the volunteers was proving to be significant because it was older people. And the impact it was having on them is a lot of older people were shielding in the first few months of the pandemic. And they were shielding, and also it became quite apparent as everyone shifted to doing things online, as we are tonight, that there was also a digital divide here, that there was possibly digital exclusion, and that people who volunteered in the heritage sector weren't volunteering in the digital sector so that they could do things online or because they had tech skills, but they were volunteering because they had interest in conservation. And the rapid shift of absolutely everything going online clearly excluded some people who had been major participants in running the heritage sector and making sure that events went smoothly and guiding people around places. And for many of our members, that was not just seen as a short-term shock, but that it could potentially be a long-term, and that if the pandemic continued, the long-term inability for their existing volunteers to engage might mean that they wouldn't return as volunteers. So that was a really serious impact that people were seeing as a threat. And beyond that, the main threat that people saw was an economic downturn. And at the time that we were meeting in June and July, I think I began each of our 5 sessions with a graph which looked at what was happening to the economy. And at that time we were saying, oh, it's as bad as 1929 and the Wall Street crash. And obviously now we're saying it's as bad as 1707 and the Great Frost. Which on one level seems humorous and on another level is fascinating because it's history, and we are now living in a live episode of Melvyn Bragg's In Our Time. But at the same time, we now know the seriousness of the impact that this is all having on the economy. And that was one of the major fears that was expressed across the meetings. And falling out of that economic impact, people's questions were then, what would happen to local authorities, where a lot of activity happens and a lot of skill lies. And we wouldn't know what that would look like until local authority budgets are set. But clearly budgets were being realigned throughout the year. And then beyond that, the next threat that was being seen as something that could be on the horizon was what would happen to the planning system. And some of the discussions that were happening primarily at a UK level around changing the planning system to make planning faster, quicker, and less restrictive. And there was a discussion about whether or not that would impact on the Scottish planning system, which itself is under very recent review. And we're currently, as BEFS, trying to influence what the next national planning framework looks like for Scotland, the NPF4, and the future Scottish planning policy, and making sure that heritage is as well protected in the future as it is now. Subsequent to the meeting, I would say that particular threat of what could happen to planning, it hasn't materialised in the same way that it has materialised south of the border. There is a review of some planning issues, and there were some planning issues around public consultation that were tweaked instantly, and arguably a relaxation on some planning restrictions to allow places to open and install protective materials so that they could have visitors. And I think most people accepted that that was permissible, if temporary, alteration to the planning system. There's been recent consultation on expanding permitted development rights, which has some implications for heritage. It's not major. It's around micro-renewables, the resiting of telephone masts, things like that. It needs kept a close eye on. It needs nuance. It needs to have funded people within local authorities to make sure good decisions do happen. But again, it's not the major threat that it appears to be south of the border. So that threat maybe isn't there, but clearly the economic downturn is. So these were the threats that came out of it. Now, before I want to talk about what were the possibilities for recovery and where heritage sits within that. But before I would like to talk about that longer, but before I talk about that, I think it's probably worth giving a bit of a summary of what else has happened since those early CHERF meetings. And I suppose since then, funding has become available across the sector from the Scottish Government and from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And I suppose since then, over August, so it's primarily around mid-August, we knew that there was a 97 million pounds worth of money coming from the UK government to be dispensed by the Scottish Government, particularly for culture and heritage. Of that, what we know specifically for heritage, so I'm excluding culture in this, and when I talk this evening, I'm probably going to be using culture, heritage, conservation interchangeably and covering lots of things. Things that I probably shouldn't. I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes, Museums, Galleries Scotland, Lucy, but I will be referring to these things. But primarily we're thinking about how the built environment is funded. The Scottish Government gave 37 million to Historic Environment Scotland. That included 5.9 million which covered their existing grants that they were committed to. They also gave 3.8 million to the National Trust for Scotland, which was obviously well publicised over the summer about the financial situation they found themselves in. The emergency fund from the National Heritage Lottery, they have dispensed 6.4 million across Scotland. Museums Galleries Scotland has dispensed 4 million on behalf of Scottish Government, and HES has recently is going to be dispensing a further 2.6 million on behalf of Scottish Government. And I think decisions on that are being made, I think, by the end of this month. There was a 4-week period for people, which is closed for people to submit bids. These were all funds to deal with the situation now. So these are quite large sums of money. Obviously, Historic Environment Scotland received the largest sum of money, at £37 million within the heritage sector. That reflects the situation they have found themselves in, because as an organisation, they were anticipating of having a turnover this year of just over 100 million. And of that, arguably only 25 million of that is government funding. There's another 14 million which they hand out in grants, but they were expecting to raise 60 million through membership and commercial activity through the properties and care primarily. Lockdown has obviously had a dramatic impact on that. So their circumstances have changed really dramatically. And as the largest player within our sector, that's obviously very, very significant. And they are our collaborator. And obviously it's important that they exist, but that's where the largest sum of government money from heritage went. Historic Environment Scotland also, working with us, have run a survey asking the sector what the impact on the sector was. It was undertaken early on in, I think, May. It first ran, and then it was rerun in September, October. The findings of that were broadly the findings of CHERF, that it was the loss of income through the loss of activity that was the major impact on people. The most recent survey revealed some more detail, that 8% of those responding were reporting redundancies within their organisations, and 33% of those who responded had used the job retention scheme, so had put some staff on furlough. And obviously the National Trust for Scotland and the Historic Environment Scotland, they had also put substantial numbers of staff on furlough. A really interesting piece of work that came out in the autumn by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and I should credit Katie Turbot, who's their former policy officer. She's now moved on, but they gave a submission to a committee within the Parliament, which was very detailed and had done a really good detailed analysis of grant recipients and engaging with the heritage sector. And one of the fascinating things about that was that they were forecasting that the heritage sector would have a 24 to 29 million pound deficit, even after all the funds had gone out. And they were basing that forecast on things improving from the 1st of October, and that things would be open and that social distancing would be changing. In fact, their worst case scenario at the point that they made those predictions is still better than what we've actually gone on to experience. So their forecast of that 30 million deficit across the historic environment sector or heritage sector is likely to be quite an underestimate because of the continued lockdown that we've experienced since then, and we now know will be carrying on. The funding that has gone out is obviously everyone has been grateful for, but also if you're paying attention to coverage in the news, I suppose Capitol Theatres in Edinburgh, I think they received £900,000 from the government. They are already saying that they were still going to face a financial crisis and that the restoration of one of the theatres, the King's Theatre, may be impossible unless they get a couple of million. I think it's 10 million they're looking for to make sure that that's sustainable. They're already going into the money that they had to set aside for a restoration project, but it's impacting on that and there are other theatres. So even though a lot of money has gone out, the needs are still immense. And that's just for this financial year. What has been interesting about the funding aspect is it's made apparent that large organisations who have been dependent on income are very vulnerable. And I think one of the interesting things is we have moved the heritage sector over the past 10, 15 years has talked a lot about sustainability and having sustainable financial business models. And you could say that Historic Environment Scotland, if we take that as a case study, has done well in terms of raising more than 50% of the money it needs to do conservation of its own, of the properties in care, as well as dispensing grants on behalf of the government. But the minute things have changed, obviously that business model is no longer possible. And for most of the heritage sector, that is the business model that many people have been looking to. So raising money through tickets, through membership, through commercial activity, through trading, through shops, through cafes. And the collapse in tourism, in global tourism, has obviously had a major impact on that, and social distancing has had a major impact on local tourist activity. So even though we are able to visit places, what we do once we're there and what we spend our money on, anecdotally, international tourists buy things from shops at heritage sites, but local tourists tend not to. We are maybe not looking for souvenirs in the same way that international tourists are. So there's major implications for the heritage that sustains itself primarily out of the tourist industry. But what's interesting about all that is what we talked about at Cherf as what were going to be the areas for recovery. And they fell into, the findings of it they came to three areas. They were, heritage needs to show that it's relevant. It needs to address exclusion. Sometimes we politely call it inclusion, but we need to address exclusion. And the thing that stuck out most for me was the localism agenda. So the relevance discussion was one that came up at quite a lot of the meetings that we had, and it was a repeated sort of discussion around heritage being more than cultural significance, which a lot of heritage is based on identifying cultural significance and protecting cultural significance. But saying that heritage is not just about cultural significance, it is also about the environment, it's about the economy, and it's about our social lives as well, which are the three pillars of sustainability. And these were very interesting conversations, because we have had discussions over the past year in looking at how you prioritise where investment goes, and we've collaborated with our members and with Historic Environment Scotland to create some kind of methodology, how you would think about allocating funding if funding was tight, which it looks like it's going to be. And it was looking at how do you tick those boxes? How do you demonstrate that what you are spending money on protects cultural significance, potentially provides a boost to the economy, does something for people socially where the asset actually is, and protects the environment. And clearly the environmental one is one that is now major because it's addressing climate change. And virtually everything that we have been doing over the past couple of 100 years within the conservation movement, arguably is to address climate change. We are saying keep everything and use it. But what we've often been fundamentally saying is keep everything that's culturally significant, keep the very special things, the best of the best, the most beautiful things. And that maybe needs to change, because it's not just that is going to contribute to the environment. It's actually all of the building stock that we currently have, whether or not it's culturally significant to us, which obviously maybe tips us into some other things, because designation is around things that are of historic importance, and who describes what these things are of historic importance or architectural importance. And it tends to be a slightly closed group. And there are shifts around that where people are talking about the social value that things have, or the emotional attachment that people have to places, which may not tick the same legislative boxes of cultural significance. But so relevance was one that came up majorly in the discussions about demonstrating that. And we've had ongoing discussion with Historic Environment Scotland, and within academia, Historic Environment Scotland have advertised for an academic to help frame that discussion on relevance. But that relevance is also important because it's how we talk to others about it. I'm assuming that everyone is tuned into this evening is passionate about heritage, as I am passionate about heritage. But the people that I engage with are maybe not as passionate about heritage as we are. And in talking to MSPs, it's not something that's a priority for them, because it's not a priority that's coming into their constituents through their constituency offices. But there are things that we offer, and there are things that I think through heritage really directly that we offer that speaks, that is relevant to current social agendas. We provide housing. We can help address well-being to a degree. I think we have to be careful not to overstate that. We provide jobs, and the conservation agenda addresses climate change by looking after what we have and making sure our carbon footprint remains low. And these are areas that we need to strengthen how we talk about it. And it may mean that we don't talk about heritage in the way that we traditionally do, which is, it's lovely, it's old, it's special, because these are not necessarily hooks for some of the people that we want them to be hooks for, and they're not hooks necessarily for the money that we're wanting to access. Just before this meeting, I was thinking about where do we sit within the Scottish Government budget? The Scottish Government budget for this year was 50 billion. The budget for culture and heritage, which captures Creative Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland, National Archives, is 0.68% of that. Scotland says that heritage is really important to us. It's a really important brand, but we only allocate 0.68 of the budget to culture and heritage and tourism as well, so the large-scale national events that happen. So that's worth bearing in mind, that that's a tiny, tiny amount of money that is allocated and that we're part of. But there are lots of other parts of the Scottish Government that have large sums of money around the environment, around housing, which we are part of as well. And it's how we hook into those bits of money, I suppose, that I'm thinking that we need to be thinking about. Exclusion was the other thing that came up, primarily because at the point that we were running the chair meetings, it was at the height of Black Lives Matter and Black History Matters, and it was just after the Colston statue in Bristol had been toppled. And it obviously came up a lot at the meetings, and one of the meetings we had an academic talking about a specific piece of work that they're doing on imperialism and Scotland's role in that. The discussions around that were very interesting. It's clearly an area of challenge for us. And obviously since then, further events have happened, and a group has been set up through Museums and Galleries Scotland with Sir Jeff Palmer, which is going to be looking at what people commonly talk about as the issue around statues. And it's really caught a lot of attention and discussion. I think it's fantastic because I have never seen heritage so discussed in the mainstream media or by my non-heritage friends as much as it has been in the months over the summer, and people engaging with history, trying to understand what happened in the past and what it means today and our relationship with it. And it's also been fascinating to reflect on what it means for us as heritage professionals, because, and I will I can give a mea culpa here, we are part of the problem in that this summer, I think everyone's reacted in a very, this is terrible that we have ignored our relationship with chattel slavery. It is terrible, but we've all ignored it. And we've all known on some level that was where the money came from for various parts of Scotland, for various assets within Scotland. But we've just chosen not to explore that. And I suppose in my own personal working life, one of the first jobs that I worked on was a conservation area appraisal of Glasgow Central, which obviously includes the merchant city. And I researched a lot and wrote about the merchant city. I don't mention anything about slavery within that, because I chose not to, because I was looking at what was the historic character of the area. I was looking at the design of it. I wasn't thinking about where the money came from. And I think we are moving into a really interesting period around how we look at heritage. And very often around, people will say that beauty is only skin deep. And within our built environment, which a lot of it is very beautiful, but the beauty is surface. And we are aware that how it was funded maybe came from something that was wildly unpalatable and savage. And we're now having to think about that and talk about it. And for me, it makes it a lot more interesting, because it means I'm not just going to see something beautiful. There are lovely things everywhere, but the lovely things also have really deep, meaningful, powerful human stories behind them as well. And they have lessons for us in the decisions that we make today. Not that we are involved in chattel slavery, but obviously the decisions that we make today that have global implications, particularly around climate change. And I think the parallels that we can draw between the past and people's attitudes towards slavery, that it happened and it was accepted, but at the same time there were people that said it was unpalatable, can be applied to us today around climate change. We know it's happening. It's probably going to reach our shores a bit later than everywhere else, but the places it's going to hit first are islands where they won't just lose their heritage, they will lose their livelihood. It will happen in sub-Saharan Africa, where they will also lose the means of living there. But we are creating that climate change in the global north. So there are parallels to be made between people's attitudes towards slavery in the past and our attitudes towards climate change today, which I think are important. But nonetheless, we're certainly embracing the discussion around race within the built environment, and we're certainly talking about it. It looks like changes are beginning to happen. But on top of that, the other observation that I would make is that I think 2 years ago, Darren McGarvey's book, Poverty Safari, came out. It was quite a sort of zeitgeisty book. Everybody talked about it. He ended up having a bit of a TV series, which looked at the lived experience of poverty and the level of dysfunction within people who grew up in deprived homes, or can exist within deprived homes. And there was quite a lot of interest in that. My worry is that then becomes secondary, and we are focusing just on race when there are multiple inequalities that we need to be thinking about within the built environment. And as obviously this year, there's another book come out called Culture is Bad for You by Dave O'Brien. It's Orion Brooke, Dave O'Brien and Mark Taylor, which if you haven't had a chance to read Culture is Bad for You, it's very interesting because it's looking at culture, and it's not really saying it's bad for you. It's saying culture is great, but it has problems within it as to who participates and consumes culture and who works in culture, and that there are deep inequalities there around race, gender, and class. And class, I think, is very difficult for us to actually talk about within the heritage sector. A lot of the heritage that we have is based on the class system, and that we've valued it and we've designated it and said it's really important. But things have changed, moved on a bit, and that more wide things are now designated. But nonetheless, it's a really difficult conversation, I think, to have. And I think 4 years ago, we had a conference on diversity, which looked at disability, it looked at race. It also looked at class. But people couldn't talk about class. It was horrific because people were really uncomfortable in talking about it. But we have to realize that there are inequalities within it. And that's really challenging when within our sector, there is a precariousness to a lot of the work that people are engaged in. Unless you're working for a public body, it's likely you're going to be working on short-term contracts. And there's a lot of self-employed on lower salaries, but there are still privileges and power that come with class. And I think us being able to talk about that and how we engage with people to consume heritage or to participate in heritage is really, really necessary. Every year we all have a look at the Scottish Household Survey when it comes out to see what are people doing. And heritage and the visiting historic sites and visiting museums are second only to live music events, and going to the cinema trumps everything. Everyone goes to the cinema, but a third of the population regularly say they go to a historic site or a museum. But when you drill down into that and you look at who's going, it's well-off, highly educated people primarily, and people who come from backgrounds that are lower education or on low salaries do not participate in the heritage sector. And there are things about that we obviously need to change. And so while we look at race, we need to make sure that we don't crowd out these other exclusions that the heritage sector is involved in. They reflect wider inequalities within society, but nonetheless, they are things that we as a sector have some control over and how we engage with the wider public. The third thing that came up was localism. The localism discussion was fascinating. I think a lot of the discussion was partly driven by our experience in lockdown. Because of lockdown, we were all living in much smaller footprints. And so people were much more interested in their local area. And some of the experiences that we heard from some of the participants, the Development Trust Association Scotland, some of the feedback they got from some of their members around the level of participation that they got in trying to deliver help locally for people who were in need were really heartwarming, superb things that have happened. And I'm sure over the past few months, we've all seen organisations totally shift from their operating model to create food banks or offer some form of local support network for people who maybe were shielded. But it was beyond just that. There was a lot of discussion around local heritage, community heritage, and how we could value that more and how we fund that. But when we look at where the money goes from the bailout, arguably from COVID, it doesn't go to the hyperlocal. It goes to quite large scale venues and places. Necessary for now to ensure that they survive. But as we look further ahead, if we were to retain the same amount of money that we were going to be funding heritage in Scotland with, is it large scale new things that we want to be focusing on? And I chatted to Christopher beforehand. I don't want to pick on anybody, and I'm not picking on anybody because some of these things are things I like. But I suppose if we think about things like the V&A in Dundee, which is seen as hugely regenerative as part of the waterfront there. I mean, I think that's about 80 million it cost. And the Scottish Government are giving it $1 million a year for a certain period of years to make sure it carries on. And it's already had another $1 million in COVID to help bail it out. Those sums of money spread over much smaller sites, less glittery, less fancy. What would that mean for Scotland as a whole? It may not have the dramatic, eye-catching impact that it has on the Tay, but would it last longer? And would it mean that we have visitors who travel differently as a result and see more of Scotland that's in better condition with a wider variety of things to see as they travel around Scotland? And I suppose another cause célèbre just south of Edinburgh, Mavis Bank. You know, do we have many country houses in Scotland? Yes. Do they all need money? Yes. Here we have one that was a jewel box but is lost. Do we spend public money on that? Is that the thing that Midlothian really needs? I happen to have just come across a stat recently that Midlothian has the highest number of families living in temporary accommodation. It's double the Scottish average. So housing is a real desperate need in Midlothian. You could argue that we could turn Mavis Bank into more permanent housing for people who need it. That's unlikely to be one that's financially viable in in the way we're looking at things now. But when we think about heritage and how it's perceived, whereas I know it has less than 1% of the Scottish budget, but how the public sees it and how politicians see it, about the money being spent when we can provide housing and employment for people, I think these decisions have to be carefully done. But I think it's often, in the long term, smaller sums of money over wider areas that may make a more substantive difference, at least to the local people who live in those places, rather than to the people who get to cut the ribbon when something big and glittering is new. So the localism was something that was a really fascinating thing, because I think it's a trend that exists. The Community Empowerment Act bill, or act that now exists in Scotland, the ability for Scottish communities to buy not just land but buildings, is changing things. And it's changing, I think, where money is needed and the sort of money that is going to be needed in the future, that it's ongoing revenue, which no funder wants to give. But it's that sort of smaller amounts of money that may actually have wider impacts in local communities for people to work out of historic places and deliver things that are a social need within that area. Heritage, for all of us, is no doubt one of the main things that we all think about. And very often, as heritage people working in policy, we're sort of saying, oh, you don't mention heritage in this. But sometimes we probably have to think, well, heritage is there, it's just not being labelled, and can we live with that? For instance, the infrastructure investment plan for Scotland is all about maintenance. I see that as heritage. Heritage is all about maintenance. I don't need to see it saying we will maintain heritage. I just need to see it say we will maintain everything. That's all I would need to say. So there are battles that I feel I don't have to fight, because I think we are captured by it, but we have to then make sure that we're part of the discussion, so that when there are sensitivities or there are things that need special care, that maintenance is informed by professionals and by people who are skilled. But a lot of what happens within heritage is a symptom of much wider economic influences. And I suppose, before I end this, there are 4 things that I think it's worth us all having a look at, because they are being looked at by a lot of people. There's a lot of discussion around the existing economy not being the economy we want for the future. And there's lots of things happening online just now, and there's been lots of things happening online over the past few weeks around economics. And I think 4 things that I find particularly interesting, and I would recommend you going over and have a look at, you probably have already looked at them, are Donut Economics, Kate Raworth's book, and she's been doing lots of presentations, and she did one yesterday, which is looking at local economies living within a standard that gives people a standard of living, but doesn't exceed the environmental standards that the planet can cope with. Now, for us in the global north, that may mean we have to reduce the choices that we have. We've had a golden age of 40 years of basically limitless choice. That maybe not, that can't continue, because we're using up far too much resources. The economics of arrival, the well-being economy, Catherine Trebek's book, also worth looking at. Where do we fit in the well-being discussion? Very often we talk about heritage being good for well-being, and the Heritage Alliance, our English counterpart, have produced a document recently around well-being and heritage. It's excellent. I don't quite see the direct link between heritage and well-being. And I know a lot of you are probably suffering from stress and you work in heritage. It's not good for your well-being. I see heritage providing a setting for well-being activities and for participation. It's not good for well-being in the same way that the natural environment is good for you, where seeing green changes cortisol, stress hormone in your saliva. Heritage does offer something around well-being, but we have to maybe be careful of what that is. But where do we fit in a well-being economy when we measure an economy not by GDP, but by other measures? Is it by the good condition of our existing environment, our built environment? Community wealth building, which is coming out of CLES in Manchester, Neil McEnroy. It's being piloted in it's often called the Preston model. They're piloting it in North Ayrshire, which is around procurement and making sure a lot of local commissioning of materials, services, it's all retained within a local economy, so that the big players, the local government, education, etc., are spending money locally. And that's good for that local economy. And if all local authorities behaved in that way, or neighbouring local authorities got together to behave in that way, it can make quite substantive difference rather than It's a local authority version of shopping local, which has been a campaign over this autumn. And I suppose the final thing that I would recommend having a look at is Jason Hickel, who talks about degrowth. And again, he's talking about us in the global north, where we have overconsumed for far too long, and the fact that the growth argument is one that we're maybe going to have to move away from, and that we can't keep growing our economies. What does that mean for us? Because we have also in the heritage sector established economic models which are based on consumption, so that we can fund the care and maintenance of the heritage that we love. Is that sustainable? Tourism, everyone's talking about whether or not tourism will return. Was it sustainable anyway, or was it damaging the planet? And I suppose we have to think really widely about these sorts of things and think about how heritage contributes to them or doesn't. One of the interesting things about us shifting to a digital world, which we all think is great, and we've reduced our carbon footprint, and we undoubtedly probably have by not traveling places. But who of us are thinking about the carbon footprint of the data centers where all this information is held? Because the carbon footprint of data centers was 2 years ago the same size as the aviation industry. We all know that flying is problematic, but do we all know that our memory storage on the cloud is as problematic? Maybe it's not as problematic because it may mean that we're not flying as a result, or we're not driving as a car as a result, but it's an area that we need to pay attention to. And where does heritage fit within that? Because data is also heritage. Is it tangible or intangible? That I couldn't answer. But that is an aspect of heritage that people who come after us will obviously be interested in having access to. And I suppose thinking about all those different sort of economic models that are being discussed, I suppose I would end with what I think is a interesting, very simple phrase that George Monbiot talks about. He thinks that we should be aiming for public luxury and private sufficiency. And the question for us is, that sounds great, because I think we probably think that public luxury means a lot of heritage would be cherished and publicly accessible and affordable. But are we prepared for what private sufficiency means? And when we look at the elections, how do we vote? I declare I'm not a member of any political party. But if you're in heritage, the best political party or the best manifesto that I've ever seen for heritage was in 2015, and it was UKIP. Now, only 1.6% of the Scottish electorate voted for that in 2015. So it would suggest that heritage wasn't something that people vote on. People vote on health, tax, education. But these are important things and have consequences for heritage. And we have an election next year, and you asking your candidates where they stand on heritage, carbon, and social inclusion will be really, really important. And I will wind up there.
Thanks, Euan. That was an amazing talk, and I really enjoyed that so much in there that I hope we can talk about. And I'm expecting a flood of questions, quite frankly. Yeah, it was great. So I would like to invite our panelists now to reveal themselves by switching on their cameras. And I'm really, really pleased that tonight we not only have people from the built heritage sector, but also from the museum and galleries sector. Really reflects the outcome, or one of the products of this year, as awful as it was. It has brought the whole heritage sector together like never before, I think. So we have Lucy Kassad, who is Chief Executive of Museum Galleries Scotland. She's an archaeologist by training and worked for the British School at Rome on excavations in Italy and Albania before returning to Scotland to work for Arkhams on the archaeological archives. She joined the Heritage Lottery Fund as grants officer in 2001 and spent 18 years with the fund, latterly as director for Scotland. During that time, she was involved in funding a huge number of projects across the heritage sector, taking particular joy from making connections across sector silos, championing collaborative work, and that was certainly very important this year. Lucy moved to the Museum Gallery Scotland as chief executive nearly 2 years ago, where she's leading the national development body through this period of rapid and unpredictable change. We have William Napier. He's a chartered building surveyor and RICS accredited historic building professional, architectural historian, and fully trained plasterer, over 30 years of experience working in building conservation. Following a traditional decorative plastering apprenticeship with L. Grandison and Son and Peebles, he trained as a building surveyor and worked at the Scottish Lime Centre Trust and the National Trust for Scotland. He is now a director with Adams Navy Partnership, a chartered building surveying practice specialising in building conservation, research and training. William is a regular speaker at conferences and CPD events on a wide range of conservation subjects and has contributed to several Lime-related technical guides and research projects. In 2011, he completed a PhD in Kinship and Politics in the Art of Decoration, a study of Scottish Renaissance decorative plasterwork and interiors. He is currently a SPAP guardian and sits on the SPAP Scotland Committee. Mark Watson is Deputy Head of the Industrial Heritage Team in Historic Environment Scotland Conservation Directorate. Like Harold Plenderleith, he was born in Dundee and took degrees in history and industrial archaeology in the English Midlands. He worked in museums and then joined what is now Historic Environment Scotland as a historic building inspector. From listed buildings, he moved on to managing change to historic buildings in areas across Scotland, urban regeneration partnerships, industrial heritage projects, and adaptive reuse of buildings. He wrote the nomination for New Lanark's listing as a World Heritage Site and was part of the nomination team for the Forth Bridge. Tonight, he looks forward to learning how the sector is going to build back better, a new normal that might lie before us. Well, aren't we all? And last but certainly not least, our very own Sarah Crofts, who is Chief Executive of ICON. She trained as an architect at Edinburgh College of Art, where she specialised in historic building conservation at the Scottish Centre for Conservation Studies. She worked for a number of architectural practices, dealing with the repair and conservation of historic buildings with Edinburgh and Cumbria. Undertaking the Letherby Scholarship awarded by the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in 2003, joined SPAP as a churches caseworker before being appointed as a project director for SPAP Faith and Maintenance Project in 2006. The next role was Deputy Director of the SPAP, which included responsibility for all the SPAP's casework and policy work. In 2015, she became Head of Historic Environment with the Heritage Lottery Fund. Thankfully for us, she returned to the voluntary sector to take up the role of Chief Executive at ICON at the end of 2018, I think it was. Is that right, Sarah? It must be right about then. So, welcome all to our panel. I was instructing them before, and I'm hoping for a very loose conversation interspersed with questions from the audience. I will maybe start off with the first one. I've pretty much abandoned all my plan for the evening I discussed with you before. Regards to planning, you started off your talk talking a little bit about planning, and this is for you, Euan, and maybe also particularly for Mark to feed into. With people sort of, with being a flight from city centres, an urban flight really happening. People are now working online and they're working in the lovely homes in the countryside. Houses are being built left, right and centre in the countryside on our lovely green belts. How do we avoid complete emptying out of the city centres of the offices, of commercial buildings, of churches, and the dilapidation of our city centres?
I'm almost certain that 0.68% allocated by the Scottish Government towards specific identifiable heritage compares extremely favourably with the percentages in England and probably the other countries of the United Kingdom. So we have done better because, frankly, the SNP government recognises that Scottish culture is a very important part of Scottish identity. That's probably also the case, it could also be said, of the Welsh culture. But I don't think that necessarily is a cause for celebration, because I think, as indeed the Churf was enjoined to do, it's necessary to show that heritage is putting much more back in to the other goals of government and of society than it takes out. Therefore, the more leverage that heritage can bring, the better. And that is by reducing perhaps the relative proportion compared to the vast sums which are obviously going into public health. So I don't think we should be in a competition to compare ourselves either with other countries of the United Kingdom, or to say, give us more money and we'll be all right, thank you very much. I think we have to show what heritage does for the rest of society.
I wouldn't disagree with you, Mark. I suppose, Krista, your question around the impact of COVID on cities, well, it's really hard to tell. Currently, well, so I'm one of the people in that we've given up our office on Princes Street to work, not in the countryside, but in a tenement on the south of Edinburgh. But while that is happening, and I think one of the other people we share an office space with, they're also moving office, but they're staying in the city centre, and our office is being marketed. There are people looking for the office, and they want the whole office space. I think it's very hard at this point in time to say things have changed forever, and they've changed, and that they're going to change really dramatically, and the city centre is going to be empty. Maybe they will change, but towns who have been suffering may do really well out of that, and that would be great news. And you could say cities have had a lot of attention. Well, Edinburgh gets a lot of attention, certainly, but we need to maybe balance it out. And I think there will be questions around business rates and things like that that need to be addressed to help people use city centres in a different way. But I think making forecasts is difficult, and I think it's really difficult to think about what will happen long term. I know there will be an adjustment. It may become more appealing for people to move back into city centres, but the affordability of that is obviously crucial, and that's a distinct challenge. You mentioned churches. Obviously, we are aware that what's happened in the Church of Scotland was already planned within the Church of Scotland, and we did some work with the Church of Scotland last year. We can't stop churches closing. That's their decision. Helping find other uses would be good, but that also means we have to relax, because they'll have to change to make them useful. And so some of the things that we think are really, really important about them, to make them useful, we may have to say, okay, there's a compromise to be made here, because the townscape effect of the church is more important than anything else. It's not all, they don't all need to change totally, but there needs to be some flexibility to make sure that we retain as many of them as possible. But that is one that we will have to support the Church of Scotland with really helpful advice, not telling them what to do, but really helpful guidance and looking for uses. We've been trying to get that seen as a civic issue by the Scottish Government. It's challenging to get them to see it in the same way that the Taylor Review picked it up in England. We were hoping that we could have something similar to the Taylor Review in Scotland, but that hasn't transpired. But there are changes afoot. Maybe we will try again to get the government, whatever the incoming government for the next Scottish Parliament is, may make that easier.
I wonder, Sarah, if you want to come in on this from your work with SPA, but also in addition to that, I'd like to ask the question, it's kind of for all of you really, relating to relevance. So if churches or some of our buildings are no longer relevant in their current purpose, where do we draw the line? What do we keep as precious? What is our red line when it comes to reimagining buildings and collections as well? You know, where do we stop, or where do we start even with the deaccessioning, with the reimagining of how we want to represent our heritage to be more inclusive?
I think the end of what you were saying there touches on actually the answer, Krista, in that question of relevance is really key. Relevant to whom? Relevant to the heritage sector and the historians and the academics, or relevant to the people who live next door, relevant to the people who use the building. So I think engagement, it's almost quite obvious in many ways that actually having conversations, engaging with people, having a discussion, opening it up to different voices is really important. And we're always going to be in danger when Group A tries to decide what should happen to Group B's assets. So I think this is I absolutely agree with you on most of what he said, actually, but particularly on the idea that compromise is going to be a necessity, and learning how to artfully negotiate compromise, how to do consultation in a way that is a genuine consultation and not just a sort of tokenistic gesture. We're going to have to learn a different kind of skill set, and we're going to have to learn from a different kind of researcher, of expert. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here, economics, you know, all sorts of things that heritage folks haven't traditionally had to get too worried about, because mostly you could kind of get away with it. The world has changed. We're going to have to cooperate with different types of people.
I hold to the view that the best use for a historic building is not the use for which it was built, it's the next use, or possibly the one after that. So I think a long life, loose fit approach to dealing with the buildings is the best one. And our members in IHBC are increasingly adept at helping to steer along those kind of uses.
Down with dogma.
Down dog.
Lucy, how do you feel about the impact this will have on museums and their collections?
In terms of so what's interesting, I suppose, this discussion around, which relates to a question that's also come in around sort of whose heritage this is, and what sort of stories we're telling, and how we actually make, I suppose, that change to being genuinely more open and inclusive in the stories that we tell. I think there's been an awful lot of activity over the past 2 decades, especially over the last decade, of trying to target an underrepresented audience with a project that tries to tackle or interest a particular group. And it's always a time limited thing. Some great examples, they've done some great things, but it's always time limited. And unless we can change the workforce, we're never genuinely going to change, I think, get or embed that further. Because I think if we've got a much, much more diverse workforce than we have at the moment, then the stories that workforce is going to present and tell about that heritage is going to be more diverse in itself and challenge the types of stories that we've always told. So it's a lot of activity. I mean, that means it's not change you can do quickly, but I think with a real commitment to that, if you can, I mean, we're putting a lot of energy and have done over the last 10 years, but continue to do and to ramp that up through different entry routes into the sector. It's challenging because we've also got a huge number of very highly qualified, very committed people looking for work in the sector, and as the sector contracts, that in itself is a problem. But I think we can't ignore we can't use that as a reason not to invest in attracting different people into our sector, to challenge us and learn those different skills and those different ways of working that are absolutely essential. So I think there needs to be a long-term change to be able to do that. It's not something that you can just, consultation isn't enough. We need to bring the people inside, not just ask them.
And that's going to be the difficult thing, isn't it? How do we open up this sector? And that's something that I really struggle with in a very, very white Scotland, in a very, very white industry. I feel I'm sort of tiptoeing around, trying desperately to make connections to help me on this journey. And for tonight, for instance, we definitely failed on that one. Try again next year. Bill, I'd like to ask you in relation to skills. You obviously have some personal experience. The NPS has been very badly affected by job losses, and I know that you left a few years ago and built up your own business quite successfully. How do you rate the opportunities in the private sector, if that's something that can be foreseen at the moment? There are obviously going to be a lot of people with incredibly specialized skills and really, really deep knowledge of their subject matter, which may or may not be hugely transferable to other sectors out there. How do you rate the chances for people in the private sector?
Well, I think that what times of recession tell us, and it sounds like we're going to be going into a deep one again, is that rather than those who are skilled and specialised now, it's the opportunity for trainees and graduates and apprentices now, and therefore the skills shortage that we face now because of the opportunities that are available to them won't be realised for another 10 or 20 years. And I often think that much of the skill shortages that we face now are due to can be traced right back to the recession of the early 1990s, which leaves a void now because we don't have the same numbers of skilled craftsmen, women, tradesmen and women working now, because the recession, which you look at then, there was a void left then. And I think that the numbers of apprentices, certainly in the crafts and the trades, have reduced significantly going back to the early 90s. And so I think that whilst it might have been starting to recover a little bit, any opportunity that's lost for trainees now is really going to show in 10, 15 years' time, where we'll lose that experience that they otherwise would have gained. So that should be a concern to all sectors, I would think. But from my own sector, you know, it is increasingly difficult to find trades and crafts to work on even sort of basic traditional buildings, and that's an issue. Despite all the good work that many organisations do, we still struggle to find good craftsmen and women to do the job. And you might suppose that the risk, many of the risks that Euan had already identified in terms of less income generation and budget cuts might have an impact on maintenance and repairs and projects, and therefore those who are already currently employed in our sector, the construction industry, their jobs would be at risk. And if the opportunities for them aren't available as well, that's another. If there's less work for contractors to do, then clearly that's a concern. From my own sort of interiors hat on, that if money's not spent on the exteriors, then clearly it has a direct impact on the things that I like internally as well. And so when SPAB contributed back in June, we obviously agreed with many of the things that Euan had identified. But another one of the things, just quickly, Krista, was that there was talk at that time about investing in retrofit programmes. And that was one of the areas of concern that SPAB Scotland had, and the inappropriate retrofit on buildings can be every bit as damaging as doing appropriate repair and maintenance. And we raised the question then about, you know, how we assess the energy performance of traditional buildings. And because Historic Environment Scotland research shows that they perform much better than the standard models and assumptions that are used to assess energy performance. But that research isn't coming out in any of how the reports are actually produced. And so a lot of people think that historic traditional buildings aren't fit for occupation because they don't perform or they're not thermally efficient. And I think that might be one way where we can encourage people that these traditional buildings are actually relevant, and reuse, as Mark has touched upon, is possible without damaging its significance. And I was heartened to hear what Euan said about not just concentrating on cultural significance, because the Borough Charter really doesn't just concentrate on cultural significance. It talks about statements of significance, and of course it covers wider society and social significance as well. So it shouldn't really be a surprise to any of us in the conservation sector that we should be thinking beyond what's significant about the actual building, but considering everybody else's viewpoint as well, especially maybe in the hinterland areas where I live. It's not just about the cities.
Yes, I really agree. There's no greener building than the existing building. Come on, who said it at the conference last year? But
that's the point that Mark was making. Yeah.
I'm very conscious that we've got questions coming in from the audience. Isabel, do you want to fire some of those off?
Well, the panel have been pretty good actually at spotting and dealing with some of them, but there've been a couple around class, one of which Lucy kind of covered already, really. But yeah, the question, people were interested by you in introducing that area of class and how how that is kind of something that we're not always very good at talking about. Maybe the one about somebody's talking about the heritage sector is hugely reliant on volunteers, poverty wages effectively subsidised by finance and better paid partners of heritage professionals. I think this will be impossible to address if we're going to endure further austerity during the coming years. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that one.
Actually, I might jump in, and just because those two topics came up together last night when Icon hosted a round table on diversity and inclusion, which is it's come out of a piece of work where we set up a task and finish group to look at it. And one of the questions that we asked our attendees was what should our definition of diversity be? And we started off with things like the protected characteristics, but actually there's a really, really, really strong call for class and social economics to be brought into that equation, because it's the cost of education within the conservation profession is a big barrier. And progression through being able to, having the luxury to be able to volunteer is definitely something that comes up time and again. Now, I don't have brilliant answers right at this moment in time, but I was really heartened that people want to think about these things and want to come up with answers. But then this is, of course, one of those topics that this is not unique to the conservation of the heritage sector. This is happening in all sorts of other places. And therefore, actually, rather than trying to invent our answer to our problem in our little silo, I'd like to see people within the conservation and heritage sector talking more broadly with other people who are dealing with the same issue, albeit in a completely different field, so that we actually have a chance of making a bit of progress rather than everyone just worrying away in their own little corners. So my big thing is this is the real time to learn how to do collaboration.
I agree with that, actually, because having worked for an organisation who relied heavily, or still does rely heavily, on volunteers, in the buildings department, when we took on student volunteers, we only ever got students who either had a well-paid partner or well-off parents who could subsidise them to enable them to volunteer their time, because otherwise students were out there working and never had the time to be able to offer their time to volunteer. And so the point that Euan made earlier about relevance and inclusivity, then, you know, as long as we rely on people working for nothing, then it's only ever going to attract people who can be subsidised by wealthy partners or parents to enable them to do that. And then that gets them a leg up on the job ladder. And so that, you know, that broad spectrum of society within the conservation sector is always going to be difficult for people to get onto.
I think it's difficult. It's difficult because everyone, with a lot of things, we immediately put these things into a personal perspective. So if I was going to be chippy, I'm the first person in my family to go to university. I went to university at 30. I cleaned offices and ran a cleaning business up until I was 35 through university. And I think coming into the heritage sector, you are coming into it is a plush world. There's just absolutely no denying it's a plush world. And when I was at university, I was 30, and the 18-year-olds that were doing architectural history and art history at Edinburgh had experienced things that were like totally beyond my ken. So there's things about perception that I suppose, and then you end up, so you have imposter syndrome, you know, and we all probably have that to degrees. But being able to talk about those sorts of things without people thinking you're criticizing them for being privileged is important. And some of the event we did where we talked about class, I had people saying things like, do we want everyone to have our values? And no, we don't want everyone to have our values, because there are a multiplicity of values. And the things that my training have now made me value, I know my grandparents would laugh at, because it's a lot of nonsense. But it's being able to sit in that zone. And if we have got training that makes us think that we know we're right, acknowledging that we're not right, that we've been trained into a way of thinking, which comes back to that wider thing that where some of the roots of heritage are around high status and totally around status stuff. And it's also about the accumulation of things. I mean, you could say that we live in an overconsumptive society because museums have been there for us to go and look at glittering objects. What do we want? We want them for ourselves. And as many of them as possible. I'm not saying that we should stop advertising, but we shouldn't stop museums. But it's being able to have that conversation with people being comfortable with it, but at the same time acknowledging that even if their parents are well off, they may not find themselves in a well-off position, and they may find themselves well off because of inheritance, but they, in terms of salaries, they're going to be on low salaries at some point in the career. So it's a difficult conversation, but I think certainly at this point in time, being able to talk about that sort of thing and acknowledge that there are other values of the past and of the things that are around us that people value. One of our members, Paz, who works with communities, so this is not a heritage organisation, but they go into communities and say, what do you want to change in your community? And they've been to some communities that they think, or their funder thinks, isn't very nice. But when they've spoken to the people there, the people who live there don't see it in the same way. They don't have the same problem with it. The same things happens in architecture. People who lived in the tower blocks in Glasgow, that collective architecture, have just refurbished. People who lived around it didn't like them. People who lived in it did like them. People's values are all different. I think as professionals, because everyone's experts, but as the professionals who are paid, we have to be really cognizant of talking to people who have a different set of values from us, different tastes in totally from the taste that we have inherited or been trained to have.
Any more questions just now, Isabel?
David, I was David Mitchell's question I was going to answer, because I'd know on Twitter he said he was going to
answer that, Euan. I think I've been waiting for you to answer that one.
If I had a magic wand, David, I'd make you disappear. If I had a magic wand, what would it? Well, I would get the government to make carbon as one of the fundamental reasons for our decision making, so that we were thinking all about what is the carbon value of the decision that we're about to make. Which maybe answer one of the other questions are, how do we make the cloud more carbon friendly? And I think the people who work in the data industry are the people to answer that more than me, but they are thinking about it by using renewables and siting data centers as close to the Arctic as possible. So in cold environments, because basically they overheat, so they need cool environments to work in. But so carbon was the one thing that I would press the government. The government should be pressed on to make decision making around what is the carbon cost of that. Everything should have a carbon cost on it, from the biscuits you eat to the swords that you sell at Historic Environment Scotland shops. We should all be understanding what our carbon consumption is, so that we can then become educated on what carbon costs are, so that we can ultimately reduce our carbon footprints. If I was, the second thing I would do with my wand, so the big organisations, Historic Environment Scotland, I would totally change how that operates and disperse it across Scotland. I'd make it this kind of ephemeral thing where there's people paid to do the roles that they're currently paid to do, they live locally, and they're involved in local decision making. It's one of the things that I feel sad about. Planning gets a hard time about lots of things, and planners get a hard time about things. And planners used to live where they worked. And I've done a little bit of nosy poking around the heads of planning in different local authorities, and they don't even live in the local authority where they make the decisions. And the same thing could apply to how things are decided within the heritage sector. And I think people living and working in an area and going native with the locals, to help people value what they're surrounded by, would be a really interesting move. It wouldn't be as cheap as centralising it in one place, although this scenario tells us that actually we can work remotely, and your staff are working remotely, David. So that's something that I think couldn't happen overnight. I don't imagine all your staff want to be dispersed across Scotland, but I think in the longer term, having a national agency, a national public body, is important, but it carrying out some of it, particularly its regulatory works, having that spread across Scotland would be a really healthy thing. It would also be a way of ensuring that expertise exists in local authorities, because they're there. We can't control how local authorities are funded, but we can control the government. The central bit can't control how resource is funded, skills are funded. So I think that would be my second thing. Third thing, I don't know, you're about to make a decision about my future, my funding for next year, so I'd say fund BEFS next year, David. And everyone else that's put in a funding application.
Just as well you can't speak. Any more questions?
Yes, there's topics all over the place, so I don't really know where to go. I think this is a nice one. Examples from the panel, please, on your favourite historic building reinvented with integrity. We could go around and ask them all that. That'd be good.
Well, I'm particularly partial to textile mills, and I'm very proud to have been associated with the 20 in Dundee that have now been converted to apartments. That's social housing and low cost home ownership that has been achieved there. Not all of those buildings are even listed, but they've still been found to be very good homes. So I'm proud of them, but I also particularly like a woolen mill in the Scottish borders, Tower Mill in Hoyk, because 4,000 local people signed a petition saying, demolish this rat-infested ruin, we don't want it. And yet, Heritage Lottery Fund, as it was at the time, and Historic Scotland, rather more reluctantly, decided not to heed that local viewpoint and nonetheless gave it some funds to be reinvented as a cinema, coffee, business gateway. Small businesses are in there. There's a water wheel still in position. So that is my favorite building, reinvented with integrity. And now, of course, all local people in Hoyk said, yes, I signed a petition about it, and I'm very pleased with the end result.
Where's to go next? Lucy? Sorry, Sarah.
That one too.
Yeah, no, I was
the case officer for it as well, so I'm delighted. Great example, that one.
I think Ailish McGuinness was at a meeting about that. It's that long ago.
Long-running saga on that one. But anyway, good outcome. So many, but I'm just going to put a plug for one of the museums of the year this year, the Gaylock Museum, which is the old Cold War listening bunker in Gaylock, which was such an eyesore as you came into Gaylock, now transformed into a brilliant museum. And just that concrete mass that provides that space for their collection is just brilliant. I love it. I think it's been done. The displays are fantastic and the building works really, really well. So, and Museum of the Year, people, if you haven't been yet, when you're allowed to travel, go to Gaylock. It's brilliant.
Okay, right, Sarah,
your Christmas shopping.
Well, those of you who know me know that I am occasionally partial to a craft ale or a beer, and so the thing that popped into my head was a former brewery in the town of Mechelen, or Malines if you prefer, in Flanders, which now makes a rather groovy conference centre. But I'm going to cheat now too. There's also a rather fun skate park in, I think it's Hastings, which is in a sort of underground Victorian pleasure garden, sort of seaside space, which is rather good. I'll try and find the link and pop it in the chat in a moment.
And Euan?
It's the former, it's Nazi submarine base in Bordeaux. It's massive, it's concrete, you can do nothing with it. It's an art gallery. It is the most amazing space that I think I've been in as a sort of reuse. It's totally atmospheric. It's ugly, it's scrappy, but it works. It's dark, and I think the reason it still exists is because it's just too expensive. You can't even blow it up because it's made of such heavy concrete. It's just an incredible space to visit in a dockyard.
Okay, my one is a local one, Victoria Little Centre. I just love the fact that there's a building inside a church. Our choir used to rehearse there, and just walking up and down those stairs with these floors was absolutely mad and exciting and fascinating, and yeah. Whether it's considered good or bad conservation, I'm not even going to go into that one, but I liked it. It was coming very close to the end of today's lecture, and unless there's any really pressing questions, I would draw things to a close now, I think.
So somebody has asked for the list of books that I mentioned, and because I'm looking on my iPad, I cannot type fast enough to answer them. So I will email them to you, Krista, and you can share the list,
share on social media
with the people that I mentioned. Yeah,
no problem. Yes, I'd be interested to see them too, actually.
Krista, we've got there was quite a lot of just really interesting comments, so we can maybe, when we're writing this up for Icon News, we can maybe include some of them as a way of not losing them.
Okay, that's good, yeah. Now, if you want to continue the conversation, there's obviously also social media. Just tag everybody in it, and you might just get a response. Right now, I just really want to thank our panelists. I've had an absolute blast. I hope it's been interesting for you. It certainly has been for me. There's so much food for thought that I've taken from tonight. It's been really good. And for me, it's been a glorious end to my time as chair with Icon Scotland. And I've just really, really would like to thank you for agreeing to come along tonight. And I hope we can do it again sometime. How about that? Okay.
Someone else can speak.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody. I'm going to go and have a drink now.
What about Will's favourite building? Jocelyn.
Oh, no, Will, sorry, Will.
You beat me to it, Mark.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
I was going to say what you said. Because doing a lot of work in Hawick, I see how much people love that place now, and it's a fantastic resource for the whole of the borders. But otherwise, being a People's boy, where I used to go to the Boys' Brigade in the old United Presbyterian Church, you always came back smelling a damp tent. And so the Eastgate Theatre, when it was opened in, well, it must be more than 20 years ago now. So I would say that was, a nice use of a building, and it no longer smells a tent, which I think is a good thing.
I approved the listed builder consent about that, so I'm very pleased that you like it too. Richard Murphy.
That's right. And again, it's a building that lay empty for a long time, and now it's much valued and loved in the community. And
he whacked out one entire side of it.
That aside, it was a fantastic addition to the community.
It's made it useful.
It is.
Smell be part of the heritage experience.
Indeed.
I think Hawick is obviously the place to go. 3 out of 6 votes.
That needs a railway.
Sorry?
Just needs a railway.
Yes.
There's a campaign, isn't there?
I noticed that yesterday Grant Shapps, English Minister for Transport, announced the undoing of beaching, including the potential reopening of railway lines. So the one from Carlisle to Melrose is potentially back on track.
Yeah, I think it would be a much loved thing in the borders. That's for sure.
I look forward to getting a train line in my little village of East Salton. Can't wait. We used to have one, apparently. Right. Okay. Thank you so much again. Sorry for missing you out. But yeah. See you all again soon, I hope, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, Krista.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.